I'm absolutely delighted to be here and also deeply honored to be giving this talk. I want to thank the British Academy and the Philological Society for inviting me, and I'm very impressed with their organizational skills for bringing good weather today. That's really very good. I'm a linguist by training and by passion. More broadly, I'm a cognitive scientist, but I'm a bridge builder by heart. So today I'm going to tell you about bridges, why bridges are important, bridges across disciplines, to understand, to enhance the scientific understanding of bilingualism as a field, and bridges across from research to society to enhance the public understanding of bilingualism. Because bilingualism is an interesting field at the moment, as we'll see, where we are at the lucky time where we are facing both old prejudices about bilingualism, but also some new prejudices about bilingualism coming from misunderstandings of current research. So this is what I plan to do for the next 45 minutes. First of all, a little bit of context about bilingualism and language learning in the UK and beyond. Then a brief overview of the research on the so-called bilingual advantage. And we'll start from the old myths, and then we'll see what the new myths are that are emerging from this research. We're going to look at some inconsistencies and controversies that we're facing at the moment, and I'm going to point out the role of interdisciplinary research, how important it is for us to work together across disciplinary boundaries to address some of these problems, some of these controversies. And then I'm going to turn to societal implications, the implications for our increasingly multilingual societies and what we can do to address some of the problems. So finally, I'm going to talk about our engaged research that goes in both directions, from research to society, as we'll see, but also from society to research, because it's a full circle and research can benefit enormously from engaging with society. So a little bit of context, as we said, we are in the so-called Anglosphere, right, where English is the native language, English is the language of the community. So there are particular challenges in the Anglosphere due to the status of English, due to the fact that people don't have much of a motivation to learn other languages because of the status of English. So learning languages is not very popular. For example, we hear this all the time. In the UK, people often think, what's the point of learning another language? Or they say, what's the point of investing in foreign language learning? Wouldn't it be better to invest in useful subjects like science, like STEM? And then everybody speaks English, right? In fact, this is actually wrong. That's a map of Europe where the darker the green, the more people speak English. And of course, Great Britain is dark, very dark, as you might expect. Scandinavia is pretty dark, but if you move gradually down south, you see that the shades of green get lighter and lighter. So it's simply not true that everybody speaks English. And I can tell you as a native speaker of Italian about Italy that this is definitely not the case in Italy. Britain has what is characterized by what I would call privileged monolingualism. This is a quote from William Hague, who used to be former Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and he said, we have some immense assets and advantages in the area of relations between nations, international courts of public opinion, and international negotiation tables. For example, the English language, connecting us to billions of people. Undoubtedly true, but also a limitation, as we'll see more in detail. And in fact, one of the limitations is that the UK has the worst language skills in the whole of the European Union, so the worst language skills of all 28 countries in the EU. And this costs the country a huge amount of money. That is a recent estimate. So it's a huge tax that this country pays for lack of language skills. And then we have Brexit. I'm not going to go into the details of Brexit, but before the referendum, before 3 years ago, there were some fears about the effects that Brexit might have on foreign language learning and enrollments in foreign languages in schools. So these are some of the headlines from before the referendum. Language learners fear a vote for Brexit. And then gradually these fears, Brexit hasn't happened, and we hope it won't, but already the effects are there. And the interest and enrollments in foreign languages is going down, has been going down, particularly in England, but also elsewhere. So some of these fears are unfortunately coming true even before Brexit, if it ever happens. Research. As I said, bilingualism is an interesting field because we've seen a major change in public opinion, in research as well, from extremely negative attitudes and opinions about bilinguals to extremely positive opinions about bilinguals. So over the last 80 years, we've seen really a big change in some respects. So that is a quote from an article that came out in 1926. And it says, the use of a foreign language in the home is one of the chief factors in producing mental retardation as measured by intelligence tests. That says it all. A little bit later, in 1941, another quote, the simultaneous learning of two languages produces a mental obfuscation of tangling that impedes the learning of other subjects. So those were the attitudes towards bilingualism then. But there are still very common misconceptions, even now, about bilingualism. For example, the idea that a bilingual child, especially a very young bilingual child, is confused. A bilingual child doesn't learn any language properly if you give them more than one language too soon. This is a very widespread attitude among people. Connected to this is the idea that if a child has another language, how can they do well at school? How can they do well in the language of schooling if the language of schooling is different? For example, English in this country. So the idea that another language is a problem, we'll come back to this, a problem to solve. And then the idea that bilingualism, there is a useful kind of bilingualism and a not so useful kind of bilingualism. So bilingualism is useful if it involves prestigious languages. So English is clearly number one in the public perception of basically all European countries. More than 95% of parents want their children to learn English because English is useful, because English opens doors for their children. Chinese is on the rise. Mandarin is on the rise. In many cases, in Scotland, it's talked about as the language of the future in many contexts. It's emerging as a prestigious language because, as we know, China has been emerging as an economic power. Other languages, however, and bilingualism in other languages are not so useful. They're not perceived as valuable. For example, bilingualism with regional minority languages or indigenous minority languages. That kind of bilingualism, it's not so useful because it's only spoken by people in small areas, so no instrumental advantage that people can perceive. Similarly, bilingualism introduced by migration, which is a very common phenomenon these days. These languages may be spoken by many people in the countries where they're spoken, but they're not regarded as useful or valuable, and so people are encouraged not to keep speaking those languages at home. I'll come back to this. So there is a good kind of bilingualism and a less good kind of bilingualism. And we'll see why research is really going against these ideas and how research is going against these ideas. First of all, we can say that bilingualism changes the brain. Now, that's very, if you say it like that, it's very impressive. Bilingualism changes the brain at different levels. At the anatomical level, for example, bilingualism, the bilingual experience, has been found to cause extra growth of cortical matters in certain areas of the brain, typically devoted to language processing, fluency, and cognitive control. It increases connectivity in particular areas of the brain, so more connections among neurons in particular areas of the brain, both at the cortical level and the subcortical level. Now, this is very impressive, but first of all, it's not surprising. It shouldn't surprise us because bilingualism is one type of experience that can have these effects on the brain, not the only one. So, for example, brain changes, anatomical brain changes, connectivity brain changes, have been found as a consequence of different types of experience. For example, a few years ago, there was a very famous, prominent study on London taxi drivers. London taxi drivers have been found to have enhanced grey matter in cortical areas that are responsible for spatial orientation. Not surprisingly, right? I mean, London taxi drivers develop very good spatial skills in their job. And in fact, in a subsequent study, they were compared with London bus drivers. And the main difference being that bus drivers, they have a lot of driving to do, but the routes are constrained. They don't improvise where they're going. They don't have to find their ways or their best way to get from point A to point B, whereas taxi drivers do. So these effects have been found in taxi drivers, but not in bus drivers in London. And there are many studies on the effects of music or musical training. So musical training is another type of experience that can change the brain at the levels that we mentioned. So the fact that bilingualism and speaking more than one language actually changes the brain shouldn't be too surprising. And from the point of view of the public perception of the usefulness of language, well, people may say, yes, it affects the brain, so what? It's very interesting from an academic point of view. But what about behavior? This is what people are really interested in, right? Whether bilingualism, whether speaking more than one language, actually changes the way we think and the way we behave in society, in our everyday life. That's much more relevant, that's perceived to be as much more relevant from the point of view of public perception of bilingualism. So does bilingualism change behavior? And I want to take this opportunity to clarify that bilingualism, I don't mean just two languages. I'm using the term in a broad sense to refer to more than one language in the brain. So not just two, but it could be three, it could be four, if people are lucky, more than one. So I'm using in this general sense. So does bilingualism change behavior? And what does research actually show? Research actually shows that, yes, bilingualism can change behavior. So remember, first of all, starting from children, remember the misconception, a young child is confused. You give them two languages, they don't speak any language properly for some time. Actually, we know from research that bilingual sensitivity begins very, very early on. And in fact, it has been found to begin even at birth. So a study was done on bilingual newborns, some of whom had been exposed to English and Tagalog in antenatal life, in the last few months of pregnancy, when the unborn baby actually hears a fair amount of what goes on in the environment, as opposed to babies who in the antenatal life had only heard English. And the babies who had been exposed to Tagalog and English came to the world with a special sensitivity to these two languages. Incidentally, I don't have any references on these slides, but I have a list of references with me that I'll be very happy to give you if you want to read more about this research that I'm mentioning. So, very far from the idea of confusion that people still have about the nature of early bilingualism. And we know that bilingual babies, again, very early on, learn to discriminate between, for example, rhythmically similar languages. At 3 or 4 months, they can discriminate languages with a similar rhythm. And we know that bilingual babies keep for longer than monolingual babies the ability to distinguish two rhythmically different languages just by watching silent faces, so mouth movements that go together with speaking one language over the other, or the other. So by watching silent talking faces, a bilingual infant at 8 months can actually tell the difference between two rhythmically different languages. That's quite amazing, and again, very inconsistent with the idea of early confusion. And we know that there are effects of bilingualism on language, so very clear linguistic effects. One has to do with mixing. So mixing, again, is a source of worry for many parents, because parents hear their child producing something that doesn't really correspond to either language A or language B, and so they worry, and they think, maybe I should have waited to introduce the second language. Maybe my child is confused. Now, there are lots of studies on mixing that show that mixing, first of all, has a grammar. Mixing has rules. Mixing is not random behavior. Mixing involves rules that children learn very early on. And so mixing usually denotes competence in both languages. In case you're wondering about that example, that's an example from one of my sons. Both my sons grew up bilingual from birth with English and Italian. And that example says, "Mommy, are we going to have crunchy potatoes tonight?" Now, the interesting feature in that sentence is the word crunciose, which doesn't exist in Italian. It's totally made up on the basis of English, the English word crunchy. But if you look at that sentence, it's a perfect sentence of Italian, where crunciose agrees in gender and number with the noun potatoes, where the adjective crunciose follows the noun that it refers to, as it should in Italian, not as it would in English. So that is an example of mixing that follows and shows very good knowledge of the language grammar. It has been found by many studies that being bilingual and early bilingualism actually favors a tacit and implicit understanding of how language works. What I mean by tacit and implicit understanding, obviously I don't mean explicit knowledge of grammar of the kind that an adult would study in a classroom context. I don't mean that at all. I mean a spontaneous understanding of the structure of language by virtue of having more than one language in the brain. And that has a number of effects, including a potentially good effect on early literacy. So early literacy, particularly learning to read, and particularly learning to read, for example, an alphabetic language. So an alphabetic language with an alphabetic script, like English and Italian and many others, including Russian and Greek and so on. The fundamental principle of learning any alphabetic language, any alphabetic script, is realizing that there are systematic correspondences between printed letters and sounds of the spoken language, or between graphemes and phonemes, if you prefer to use these words. And that discovery of the so-called alphabetic principle is facilitated by the bilingual child's sensitivity to the sound structure of their language. And once it's discovered in one language, it doesn't have to be rediscovered in another alphabetic language. So we get questions from parents who ask us, is it a problem if my child learns to read in Spanish, for example, knowing that they're going to go to school and they have to learn to read in English? And the answer is, not only is it not a problem, it's probably an advantage. The discovery of the alphabetic principle is easier in a language with shallow orthography, like Spanish or Italian, than it is in a language like English. Once the discovery is done, it doesn't need to be done again. And better ability to learn other languages. Knowing two languages or more than one is a very good starting point to learn a third language or a fourth language, and advantages have been documented in that respect too. Now, there are many effects of bilingualism, positive effects of bilingualism, outside the language domain. And some of these effects are the ones that are better known in society because they attract a lot of media attention. One of these effects is an effect on the ability to take another person's perspective. So perspective taking, or theory of mind, if you want to use this terminology, has been found in bilingual children who developmentally reach the awareness, the ability to understand that other people can have a different point of view or a different perspective from their own at an earlier age than monolingual children. All children have to get there eventually, but bilingual children have an advantage in understanding this difference between their own perspective and another person's perspective. Where does that awareness come from? It comes from the fact that bilingual children very early on realize that not everybody is bilingual, and not everybody is bilingual in the same languages. So they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to. And they have to choose the right kind of behavior as well. Mixing, for example, is much more common when bilinguals talk to other bilinguals than when bilinguals talk to monolinguals, because bilinguals know that if they mix, they're not going to be understood. So that early awareness, which is rooted in the bilingual experience, is reflected in a more general sense in a better understanding that it is possible to have a different point of view, both in terms of beliefs, in terms of general assumptions, in spatial terms. If you're sitting over there, you can't see what I see here, and many other kinds of perspective taking. And then there are advantages for cognitive control. And this is the area where there's a lot of attention on this area on the part of the media, and there are many discussions, as we'll see. So this has to do with a more efficient control of attention. Now, attention is something that we have to pay no matter what we do. We have to pay attention. Otherwise, we don't do it well. We have to pay attention in a focused way, in a way that doesn't allow us to be distracted by many other factors that could potentially distract our attention. So, a more efficient control of attention is what has been found to be related to bilingualism. And similarly, the ability to handle conflicting information. A good example that is very often used is the so-called Stroop task that many of you will know. So the easy condition in the Stroop task is this one, when you simply have to read these words aloud. Okay, no problem. Blue, yellow, red, purple, black. The interesting condition is this, where you have to say the color of the ink that the word is written in as fast as you can. So you have to say yellow, but the word says blue. You have to say red, but the word says yellow. You have to say blue, but the word says red. So there is a conflict between the name of the color that you have to say and what the word actually says. And you can't help reading that word because we are all proficient readers. Okay? So that slows you down, and that's one example where bilinguals have been found to be slowed down less than monolinguals because of this better way of handling conflict in paying attention. I'll come back to the misunderstandings of this kind of research later. But just to finish this brief overview of research on child bilingualism, it has been found that there are effects for decision-making. This is one of the newest areas of research in bilingualism. And the finding is that bilingual speakers tend to be more rational when they make decisions in their second language compared to people who make decisions in their first language. So decisions in the second language are more rational. Decisions in the first language tend to be more prone to emotions or more prone to emotional biases or emotional reactions. Now, if this is true, this would have very important consequences, right? Because more and more decisions are made by non-native speakers at all levels, in many different contexts. So if this is the case, we would expect very important consequences for government, for councils, for all places where decisions are routinely made, not only by native speakers, but also by non-native speakers. So, why these effects? Many of these effects are supposedly due to the fact that in all bilinguals, the languages are always active. If there are two, both languages are active. If there are more than two, all these languages are simultaneously active. So, because two languages can't be produced at the same time, right? The language that is not being produced has to be excluded or inhibited. So bilinguals do this all the time. Most of us are bilingual here, probably all of us are bilingual. I'm speaking English to you. My Italian is very active in my brain, as well as the other languages I know, and my brain is exercising inhibition or exclusion of these unwanted languages. So this happens in all bilinguals. It's part of the bilingual experience. And again, the idea is that the bilingual experience is extended and this effect is generalized more broadly outside the domain of language, leading to a better ability to handle cognitive control, not linguistically, but otherwise, in a more general sense, or the ability to inhibit emotional reactions so that the decisions are more rational when people make them in their second language. And so, a general better ability to handle and monitor conflicting information, as we said before. So, brief overview of child bilingualism. And one of the main points that arises out of this research is that it doesn't really matter which languages we're talking about, because what matters, according to this research, is the fact that we have more than one language in the brain. Not whether these languages are spoken by many people, not whether they're associated with political economic prestige, but it's the fact of having more than one language that matters. So from this point of view, this is a very important message. There are no useful languages or less useful languages. All languages are potentially good, regardless of the kind of prestige they have in society. Although we can't ignore the attitudes that people have towards these languages, and we'll come back to that. But before we come back to that, let me say something about late bilingualism. So I said that I'm using the term bilingualism in a broad sense to denote more than one language at all ages. So I'm a late bilingual of English. I didn't learn English when I was a child, unlike my children. But I would regard myself as bilingual, just like my children. And so there are myths about adult second language learning. So learning a language as an adult. One is that you can't learn a language very well as an adult, right? I mean, there are limits. You have to be a child to learn a language really well. Or how do you learn a language when you're an adult? You go to a classroom, and you find a teacher, and you get taught the grammar of the language, and you get corrected if you make mistakes. These are precisely what a child doesn't get. A young child doesn't know what to do with grammar and error correction. Okay? But an adult, that's the way you learn a language in adulthood. That's what many people think. And then if you're an adult learner, you have at least one language, your native language. So that language is going to affect the second language. So there's going to be interference from the first language to the second language, but not vice versa. So what does research show? Very briefly, one thing that research shows is that it is possible to reach very high levels of competence if you start a language as an adult. We study the so-called native-like or near-native speakers in Edinburgh. This is one of the areas in which we concentrate. And these people are not Martians. They have a brain like you and me. So we have to understand what enables these people to reach these very high levels of competence, which is obviously possible. And anybody who knows a second language reasonably well knows most of what they know is implicit. It's not conscious grammar. It's not what you learn consciously and deliberately. That's only the tip of the iceberg. most of what you know as part of your second language competence is implicit. And people can learn implicitly, even if they're adults, just like children, except that they have fewer opportunities and less time to do so compared to a child. And then, this is another area in which we specialize in Edinburgh, there are effects in both directions, not only from the native language to the second language, but also from the second language to the first, which doesn't mean that you lose your first language. Your first language changes, and that's a natural process. It changes because two languages in contact affect each other, both in the same individual brain and then in bilingual societies. And that's one of the ways in which languages can change diachronically. So understanding, in fact, we think that these changes in the native language, unfortunately called attrition, that's the term that is used in the literature, rather negative connotations. But as I said, it's not necessarily loss that we're talking about. We're talking about changes, very selective changes. And we think that the more the native language is open to change, the better the second language can be learned. So there is a close connection between changes in the first language and high level of ability in the second language. And there are cognitive effects found in adult second language learners. So we found effects in university students, so young adults who get a degree in a foreign language. So they start learning a language at age 18 or 19. And in much older learners, we're doing studies where people in their retirement age are exposed to a new language, a language that they've never seen before in an intensive course. And we measured their cognitive reactions before the course, after the course, and their brain responds extremely well. Obviously, they may not have the time scale to develop very high levels of proficiency, but the brain responds very well, even in much older learners. And there are effects of aging that have been found in the literature widely, and these also get quite a high visibility in the media. Effects on cognitive abilities, the natural decline of cognitive abilities that happens in most people, so certain cognitive abilities like memory or attention, these naturally decline with age, but people compensate in different ways. Bilingualism is one way in which you can compensate for this natural decline of cognitive abilities. Probably not the only way. In fact, there are comparisons, research that is trying to compare the effects of bilingualism with the effects of musical training, the effects of quilting, the effects of exercising the brain in active ways. Pathological aging, some studies have found that if bilinguals are unlucky enough to get some kinds of dementia, the initial symptoms of these diseases appear 4 or 5 years later compared to monolingual people who get these diseases. Again, like in all these domains, we need more research, and that goes without saying. But if these findings were supported by further research, this would be amazing, because 4 or 5 years is a very long time in terms of individual independence. It's a very long time. It has important implications for public health, for example. In Edinburgh, we have this amazing resource. This is part of our school, the psychology department. This is called the Lothian Birth Cohort, and these are more than 1,000 people who were all born in 1936. And they were tested at regular intervals over the decades, starting from when they were 11, so in 1947, and then at regular intervals across the lifespan, some of which that is the same individual who was 11 in 1947 and is now 70 plus. Not all of them are still alive, but those that who are continue to be tested. So this is an amazing picture of individual decline, if you want, or development over the years in longitudinal data from the same individuals. And one of the findings that was reported is that you can predict, so performance at age 11 actually predicts performance at age 70 plus. But if people did a foreign language, if they studied another language at some point during the lifetime, their performance at age 70 plus is better than what would be predicted on the basis of their performance at age 11. So learning a language has an effect, and we have longitudinal data as well. Now, new myths. Remember, there are the old myths, and now there are some new myths. One is bilingual children are more intelligent, right? Bilingual children are geniuses. You give them languages, and that's an investment for their brain. You can turn them into really, really intelligent people and increase the likelihood of them getting wonderful jobs, and so on and so forth. These are some of the entries from Google. You don't need to go very far to find these, right? How language can increase your child IQ, your baby's linguistic superpower, how to raise bilingual children, does your child speak the language, hear why, et cetera, and how to make your child smart, genius kids, and so on and so forth. The opposite side of the spectrum, of the age spectrum, if you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's, right? And I got this question from several people, including journalists, and it would be very nice if this was the case. Unfortunately, it's not the case, because as we've seen, it's not a matter of preventing Alzheimer's or dementias. It's a matter of delaying the appearance of the first symptoms, which is a very different matter. But again, this is what you get from the web. Bilingual prevents Alzheimer's, etc. Bilinguals wards off dementia, etc., etc. And there are many other fancy ones. I couldn't resist putting some of these here because it just gives you the idea of how far people can go in making up, new stories, right? So, stimulates some pleasure centers in the brain as sex and chocolate. And if you're bilingual, you're obviously more beautiful, and et cetera, et cetera. So, clearly, these are myths, arising out of the misreading of research. But now what we have to ask ourselves is, are these effects always found? Are they automatic? And the answer is no. So these effects that I described before are not always found in all bilinguals, because bilingualism is not a black and white or black or white dimension. It's not that you're either bilingual or you're not bilingual, or if you're either bilingual or you're monolingual. Bilingualism is a continuum defined by many factors. And in research, we are all trying to find out how these other factors affect the likelihood of finding a positive effect. So bilingualism is not a categorical variable or a clearly quantifiable variable. This has gone very far in certain areas of research, and in certain areas of research, there is a tendency to deny all the effects that were previously found. So this is a good example of a paper that says, categorically, there is no coherent evidence for a bilingual advantage in executive processing. That means that if you try to replicate the studies, you don't always find the same advantages. But why not? That's the question. And does it really mean that the benefits don't exist and that, they were all a new myth, which is what some researchers actually tend to conclude. And this is where interdisciplinarity plays a very important role. So this is the cover of an issue of Nature on interdisciplinarity. I like it because it really says why scientists must work together to save the world. So what we need to understand is how these different factors interact with bilingualism and determine why the effects show up in some contexts but not in other contexts. And we need to combine different disciplines in doing this. For example, linguistic and cognitive factors in bilingual cognitive control. Most of the research is done in cognitive psychology, the research on the bilingual advantage. But what about linguistic factors? This is where linguists, can come into the picture and actually provide some help. So the current focus of cognitive research is on the so-called disengagement from inhibition. I told you before, the early focus was the ability to inhibit, coming from the linguistic experience and the fact that you have to inhibit the languages you're not using. and that is reflected outside the language domain. Now, the more precise focus that is emerging is the ability to disengage from inhibition, not so much the ability to inhibit, but the ability to recover from inhibition. So this is from the web, and by the way, I'm told that that's not a trumpet. I'm sorry, but, whatever you want to call it, that's not the point. If you have to remember the word kite and ignore the word anchor or a picture of an anchor, right? And then you see the picture of a trumpet or whatever, a tube or whatever that is, a tuba or whatever, and then you don't have a problem, right? Because, that's a different word. But if you have to ignore trumpet, and then that's precisely what you have to say. So you've inhibited trumpet as part of the task, but then trumpet appears and you have to recover from the inhibition that you've applied in order to produce that word. That's what disengagement from inhibition is. Now, this has very interesting consequences for minority languages. Some of you work on indigenous minority languages. We do too. And it's interesting that when you look at the presence of these effects in minority languages, sometimes they're found and sometimes they are not found. So, for example, in Sardinian Italian bilinguals, yes, they're found. Cognitive benefits. Gallic English, yes. Frisian Dutch, yes, but not always. Cypriot Greek and Greek, yes. Catalan Spanish, yes. Basque Spanish, no. Welsh English, no. So why not? Why do we find this kind of inconsistent picture? If you stop at cognitive psychology, well, you say these are all languages, these are all bilinguals, right? But they're bilinguals in different types of languages. For example, could language distance play a role? Whether the two languages are typologically similar or not. And you have similar languages and you get the effects found not always, but in the majority of cases. So Catalan Spanish, Sardinian Italian, Cypriot Greek and Greek, Frisian Dutch, these are all typologically similar languages, unlike Welsh English, Basque Spanish, and Gallic English, where, 2 out of 3 cases, the effect is not found. So it seems that language distance plays a role so that, the more similar the languages are, the more of an effort you have to put into separating them, into inhibiting the languages that you don't want, precisely because they're so similar. However, there's another factor that plays a role, the patterns of bilingual use in these communities. So, are we talking about dual language context, where the two languages are heard in potentially every context, so there's no rigid separation between the two languages, in which case the effects tend not to be found, so Welsh English, Basque Spanish, but Catalan Spanish, yes, the effect is found, as opposed to single language context where there is a diglossic situation. One language is only spoken in this context, the other language is only spoken in the other context. And there's a separation between the two. And that's where most of the effects are found. So Sardinian Italian, the effects are found. Cypriot Greek and Greek, the effects are found. Gallic English, the effects are found. These are languages that are not spoken in all contexts. They tend to be separated. And you would expect, from the point of view of disengagement or inhibition, you would expect that the stronger effects are actually found in dual language contexts, where both languages are spoken in all contexts, because you have to be ready to switch from one language to the other, and therefore disengage from inhibiting one or the other language. But this is not what we find. So it seems that language distance is the primary factor in this kind of effects, and we need more research. Decision-making, rational decisions in the second language, as we said, and emotional decisions in the first language. Why? We are doing a project at the moment where we're finding very interesting findings having to do with the way people actually process language. Again, in the original research, the way people process language is not taken into account. So we have to look at what pragmatic inferences, for example, people make as L2 speakers, second language speakers, or first language speakers when they process language. So the classic case in this kind of research is, for example, the Asian disease problem that says there's a dangerous new disease, it's been going around. Without medicine, 600 people will die from it. And in order to save these people, there are two types of medicine that you can use. One is called gain frame. If you choose medicine A, 200 people will be saved. If you choose medicine B, there is a 33.3% chance that 600 people will be saved and 66.6% chance that no one will be saved. So one is the safe option and one is the risky option. The outcome is absolutely equivalent, but it's the kind of inferences that people make when they read these scenarios. And that's a gain frame. The loss frame, you just say, instead of 200 people will be saved, you say 400 people will die. Again, the outcome is absolutely the same, but this is framed in loss terms. And so it has been found that, well, if people make a decision in the first language, they have a so-called loss aversion bias. So they choose the safe option more frequently in the gain frame than in the loss frame. So there is a framing effect. But if people make the decision in the second language, they don't have the loss aversion effect. So they're more rational. They can see that the outcomes are the same. They're not driven by the emotional, loss of life or things like that. So we wanted to know, yes, are second language speakers really more rational because of reduced emotionality, because they can control for their emotionality, or because they interpret numbers in different ways? So, for example, 200 people will be saved. Is that interpreted as exactly 200 people will be saved, or at least 200 people will be saved, or at most 200 people will be saved? That can really make a difference. And so we looked at the interpretation of numbers, and to cut a long story short, we found that the more proficient the second language speakers are, the more similar they are in making decisions, more similar to first language speakers. So proficiency has to be taken into account, but also the framing effect is stronger for the exact interpretation and for the at least the lower bound interpretation, but not for the upper bound interpretation, so at most. And we found that the higher the proficiency, the more similar the interpretations are. There are more exactly interpretations for proficient second language speakers than for first language speaker. So basically, we have to look at how people understand language before we conclude that they are less rational or more emotional or less emotional or more rational. And bilingual children, we are concluding a project where this is an interdisciplinary project with sociologists, and it looks at how children live their bilingualism, how children experience their bilingualism. This is something that we don't usually study in our type of research. We test children, and then we ask parents about the children, but we don't ask the children. In this project, we actually asked the children. We used the qualitative measures in conjunction with the quantitative measures that we typically use, and we wanted to see whether a child's positive or less positive perception of their own bilingualism and of the languages they speak can correlate with their performance in cognitive tests, for example, or in linguistic tests. And the result is yes. So positive attitudes and encouraging environments definitely correlate with the likelihood of seeing a cognitive effect, a cognitive advantage in these children. So, but we need to work together and join methodologies in exploring these factors. And we are embarking in this very difficult kind of research where we want to see whether there are any predispositions to benefit from bilingualism. And this is a very tricky one. So what we see as consequences of bilingualism, could it be that these consequences are at least partly affected by cognitive predispositions before the bilingual experience? So some people may be better at taking advantage of the bilingual experience compared to others. And we don't have any data to talk about. We're applying for grants. This is something that we'll explore very soon. So there are implications for many sectors of society: families, multilingual classrooms, health, language learning in primary schools, language policy, minority languages, and also businesses. In the family, having parents who speak different languages is not enough if the child doesn't hear enough of both languages. So creating an environment where a child is exposed to both languages in an engaging way is very important. Creating an environment where the child hears the language not just from mommy or daddy, so one person, but possibly from other speakers, because we know from research that exposure to variation, what we call normal variation, is very important. Hearing people speaking in different ways, this is what helps language development. And in minority languages, typically that is not there. So creating a mini community is very important. And finally, positive attitudes, of course. As I said before, children are very sensitive to what people think about their being bilingual, and their being bilingual in particular languages. Patterns of language use in the family and in society, I've already mentioned that, that's another factor. Literacy, the presence of literacy, not just in the majority language, but also in the minority language, because that opens up new cognitive horizons as well as other sources of input in the minority language. And for migration, we deal with migrations all the time. Migrants are under pressure not to speak their home language. In many cases, they have internalized this message. In other cases, they get this explicit message when they arrive to their country of destination because they think that their language is an obstacle to the successful integration of their child. Now, we know that that's not true. Of course, a child who comes here has to learn English to function well, but not from the parents. The parents are learners of English themselves in most cases, so they can't provide a very good environment for successful learning of English to their children. And the family communication is also impoverished as a result. So maintaining home languages is advantageous from multiple points of view. There is a potential tension there that we shouldn't ignore between integration, the need to integrate, and the maintenance of one's own language and culture and so on, which can be interpreted in different ways. Migrants are very often categorized as problematic, having a problem that needs to be solved rather than as resources. There is a tendency that we see to pathologize or problematize migrant children, for example, or migrant adults, and there is a bias in instruments that people use in education or in health. A monolingual and monocultural bias that guides these tests. And so if a bilingual child, a child from a different language background, does these tests, is obviously that child is at a disadvantage. And there are challenges as well that we can't ignore. So smaller vocabulary in a bilingual child. Very often a bilingual child has a distributed vocabulary over more than one language compared to a monolingual child who knows all their words in the same language. And so again, if you give them a test that is clearly based on monolingual vocabulary norms, a bilingual child won't do very well. Atypical language behaviour, silent periods, saying very little, understanding more and more, but not saying very much. We get questions from nurseries, from schools. This child arrived 4 months ago. She's not saying very much. What are we supposed to do? Identity and belonging. Children don't like feeling different. If their bilingual marks them as different, they go home and they want to speak English to their parents. Or they tell their parents, please don't speak this language in front of my friends. This happens in many cases. Disorders, some language disorders may look superficially similar to stages of language development. And so very often, there is a risk of overdiagnosing or underdiagnosing impairments in bilingual children. So health professionals have to be able to distinguish between a real impairment and a normal stage of language development. Language learning at school, the usual story is that the brain's child is like a sponge, right? You give them some input and they suck it in and magically they become fluent. No, it's not the case. Younger is not necessarily better unless a child has enough input in a second language, unless the child is engaged, unless the child hears the language from multiple speakers. And we know from collaborating with the Scottish government that this can be a problem. In their 1+2 language learning plan, 2 languages in primary schools, the first introduced at age 5, the second at age 10, but you have to understand that children learn very differently at 5 and at 10. You have to understand that 1 hour is not enough input, and that's the typical time allotted to foreign language learning. Teachers should be properly trained to understand how children learn languages at different ages. Parents should be on board. They should also have the information to be supported of their child. And minority language, I've already said why it's important to maintain them and why changes in languages is absolutely normal. It's not loss or contamination, but in many cases we see a desire to maintain the minority language the way it was spoken by our great-grandparents. That's not a very useful way of maintaining the language, particularly for young people, and so change has to be understood. And finally, just very, very briefly, business needs languages as well, not only because of, the need of trading with particular sectors in particular countries, but because languages can allow people to do business better, to have specific business skills. So soft power is a word that has been used by many people, but that's the ability to negotiate, to understand where proposals come from, because you can understand the other person's perspective, and so you have a better understanding of what is proposed around the table. And so knowledge of another language is an advantage over monolingual speakers of English. So a second language speaker of English has an advantage over a monolingual speaker of English, and also in terms of prioritizing. So what can be done? I've given you a very broad overview of research, old myths, new myths that tend to coexist at the moment. So this is really the prime time to give people enough information. So we think that by providing accessible and accurate information, people can make better decisions, whether it's about their children, their students, their patients, their partners, their policies. And that's where Bilingualism Matters comes from. That's the center that I started 10 years ago, and we started very small, and then we started expanding in different sectors of society, and we started expanding geographically, and we now have a network of 26 branches, if you can see the red dots there, 19 branches in the UK and in Europe, 5 in the US, 1 in the Middle East, 1 in China, in Hong Kong, that I opened 3 weeks ago, and the next will be Canada. So we have a huge database. We have the best researchers in the world working in these institutions, in these partnerships. And we can really compare. We can do more research that is focused on better understanding how bilingualism works, but also better public engagement, better ways of communicating research to the general public. We can compare our good practices. And so we goes from research to society, and obviously we are researchers. We do projects of all kinds, but sponsored by many different funders, and we have a range of collaborations. But it's important to remember that research benefits from this. So there are effects from society back to research in terms of more insightful research, a better understanding of the context of research questions, and more clarity in formulating these questions and in presenting research and research communication. We involve students as volunteers all the time. We train them to communicate what they do in a clear way to non-academics, and we know from experience that this is highly valued by potential employers. So, to conclude, I talked about bridges at the beginning. I really believe in the importance of bridges, both across different research fields, but also across research and society. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Antonella. That was very impressive. Shall we give our speaker a hand?